Hello, and thank you for joining us today in our studies of 1 Samuel. Today we are in 1 Samuel chapter 10, and here Saul is going to be proclaimed king. Now, as we went through and read the chapter yesterday, we noticed a number of different things that take place within the confines of this chapter. And what we'd like to do today is go through the chapter and pull out some of the lessons that we can learn, or some of the facts of interest that are found within this chapter. So let's look at three different things this morning as we try to examine chapter 10. The first one I want us to look at is in verse number 9. There it makes the statement that so it was when he had turned his back to go from Samuel, that God gave him another heart, and all those signs came to pass that day. The first thing that we have in chapter 10 is Samuel's prophecies. The things that Samuel says are going to take place and are going to happen to Saul. Now, these are going to cover a number of different avenues, a number of different types of events that will take place when Saul leaves Samuel's presence. And yet Samuel is going to lay them out in order as to what's going to happen and how it's going to happen and how all of these things are going to work. And it says in verse 9 that all those signs came to pass that day. You know, back in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses lays out for the people how it is that they can know a true prophet from a false prophet. And it is stated that a true prophet is one who, when he says something will happen, it happens. If he makes a prediction, if he makes a statement about something and it doesn't happen, that's not a true prophet. That's not a one that can be relied upon. That's not one who's actually speaking for God. Here Samuel makes a series of predictions, and every single one of them plays out over the course of the day. The idea here of Saul being given a new heart is not in a literal physical sense, but rather that God gave him the ability to do things that he had never been able to do before, which is what you see when Saul begins to prophesy and the questions begin to be raised later on in the chapter of if Saul is among the prophets. Because this was something that Saul never had the capability of doing before. This was not something that the people were used to seeing or that Saul's family was used to seeing out of him. But it is something that God, for this limited amount of time, gives him the ability to do as a means of showing him what he is going to do with Saul. And in the impact of making him see that the things that have been stated about him are going to come to pass. The second thing that I want us to notice is down in verses 21 and 22. Because there we read that as Samuel goes through the process of calling forth the new king, that he had caused the tribe of Benjamin to come near. All the tribes are gathered together, and he calls the tribe of Benjamin out, and then he calls the family of Matri out, and then Saul is called out, and he is chosen. But when they look for him, he is nowhere to be found. Saul becomes the reluctant king. As a matter of fact, it's stated in verse 22, they ask if he's there yet, and the Lord responds and says, there he is, hidden among the equipment. Here is the man who is head and shoulders above all of the people of Israel. Here is the man who would be easily seen and recognizable for his presence, and yet he is hiding. He is not sure he wants to be king. He is not sure he has what it takes to be king. It is why when he has this discussion with his family about what it was that took place and all of those things that are going on, he leaves out his discussion with Samuel about kingship. He doesn't tell his family what is going on in those regards. Saul is a reluctant king. Now, on the one hand, That's somewhat of an important quality to some degree, in that, he's not one seeking for power. He's not one who is arrogant about who he is and what he can do and thinking that he's better than everybody else. Unfortunately, Saul's humility, and in some cases his fear in this regard, is not going to remain that way. And Saul will eventually have an arrogance about who he is and what he can do and what he is allowed to do. But at this juncture, early on in the days when Saul takes the throne, Saul is reluctant. He is not sure that this is the right thing for him. And yet, he is God's choice. And God has spoken in this regard. And when you come down to verse 24, the people respond by saying, "Long live the king." He has the people's support as well. And then you come to verse 25. And in verse 25, we have the third thing I want us to notice this morning from chapter 10, because there's a statement here that I find to be rather interesting in this regard. In verse 25, it says, "Then Samuel explained to the people the behavior of royalty, and wrote it in a book, and laid it up before the Lord. And Samuel sent all the people away, every man to his house." There's this interesting phrase in verse 25, the behavior of royalty. The term in the Hebrew really carries with it the ideas of the designations of kingship, or the way that things will operate with a king. Remember, the people of Israel have not had a king before. God has been their ruler. God has been their king through the judges and through Moses and through Joshua and so on. But Moses and Joshua weren't kings. And the judges were simply deliverers of the commands of God and saviors of the people of God by means of their defeating their enemies. They've not had a king before. And so there need to be some rules laid out. There need to be some understandings in place of what the responsibilities are and what the power and the authority is and all of these various things. And Samuel is going to be responsible for writing down in a book to place before the Lord the behavior of royalty. It's something that's going to have to be learned. Because as was talked about in chapter 9, the king of Israel is going to have wide powers as far as what he is allowed to do and the lengths to which he is allowed to go within his kingdom. And we're going to see many times over the way that they utilize that power. But it is a power that is freely given by the people of Israel. It is what they think they want. And once again, we have the warnings being issued. Be careful what you wish for. It might not be exactly what you thought you wanted. And yet, here we are, with a king in Israel. Next time we'll come back and we will begin looking at 1 Samuel chapter 11. I hope that our study has been beneficial to you, and I hope that you'll come back and join us tomorrow. But until then, have a great day.